Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
Are you happy with your current level of profitability? Well, if you're like the average dentist practicing in the United States, probably not. And the basis of this statement, while being primarily anecdotal, in other words, what I've heard from brand new clients, which is why many of them became clients in the first place, does have some hard data to back it up. First, we have general inflation over the past 4 years that we've all experienced. Here in the United States, it's been over 21% since March of 2020. So whatever cost you $1 in February of 2020 now costs you at least $1.21. And these are the official statistics. So yeah, they're probably lower than they should be. And you've seen this jack up about just every expense category, from staffing to marketing to lab supplies and so on. And then we have an interesting factoid from the ADA Health Policy Institute regarding general dentist net income. Now, this data is a little old. It's from 2022, but it shows the median net income from 2019 through 2022 for general practitioners, GPs. And it shows you whether it's gone up or down. As a matter of fact, I'll put a link to this on the episode webpage. So what does this show us? Well, median net income for dentists in 2019 was $186,620 a year. That was the median, okay? The average in 2019. And how did this change over a 4-year period ending in 2022? Well, median net income for dentists in 2022 was $186,780. The math? It was an increase of $160 a year, which is 0.08% of a percent over a 4-year period. Now, by comparison, inflation from 2019 through 22, it's higher now, of course, but through 2022 was over 11%. So just to track with inflation and see no further benefit, these dentists' net income, the average median net income, would have had to have increased by more than $20,000. So in other words, for it to track with inflation from 19 through 2022, the average dentist median net income would have had to have been over $207,000. Well, where is this net income being eaten up? Well, overhead. Expenses are up, and the last one to get paid is the doctor owner. And look, it's a no-brainer that you'd like to be more profitable, but what do you do about it? How can you reduce expenses and at the same time increase profitability? Well, that's what I want to talk to you about in this week's episode. I'm going to focus on the top 6 reasons that we found why your overhead may be too high. I'm going to explain each, and even more importantly, I'll get into what to do to fix them. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And probably the best place to start before we get into specific reasons or categories is with the basic concept, at least as I'm going to be referring to it, of overhead and profitability in general. So, I mean, look, let's start with some common sense basic stuff. What is the profit formula? It's real simple. Profit is essentially what's left over after expenses. So if I make $100,000 and I spend $80,000, I have $20,000 in profit. Now, of course, because I've had people bring this up before, I'm going to owe some taxes on that $20,000. That's true, but my net was 20, even though I'm going to pay whatever I'm going to pay in taxes, and I'll be left over with whatever I'm left over. We're not talking about net after tax. We're talking about net in the business, okay, just to be clear. So income minus expenses equals profit. So your overhead amount, because sometimes people get freaked out by the amount of overhead, the dollar figure associated with the overhead that they have is really immaterial unless you relate it to your income. I could tell you, well, I have a $500,000 a month overhead. You might go, oh my gosh, that's terrible. But if my income is $1 million, well, then I have a 50% overhead and I'm netting $500,000. Everything's fine and dandy. So the more important aspect of overhead, beyond obvious waste, where you're just wasting money, is how it relates to your income. In other words, what the percentage of your overhead is, or what your overhead percentage is, rather, is a better way of saying it. And I've offered this before. You may or may not have taken me up on it. You really, 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 really need to know what your overhead is. We do offer an overhead sheet. It's probably the most complete sheet I've seen in the industry because we cover just about everything. It's a spreadsheet. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage if you want to download it. It's a 25 category overhead sheet to really cover any type of expenses that you might have. It's a free download if you want to check it out. Put a link on the episode webpage. But let's take a look at this. Ideally, a solo practitioner, Solo doc, maybe one or two hygienists should be in the low 50% overhead range, right? So if they're collecting 100,000, their overhead should be 50, 52, 55, etc. Now that's an established doctor. If it's a newer practice where, they've got a lot of loans and leases, obviously it's going to be higher, as far as what they get to keep because they'll be servicing a lot of debt, but their overhead as a percentage should be in the low 50s. That's ideally where you want to live. As you add associates, you expand your practice, you add associates, and it's not just you doing all the work. Your overhead as a percentage may go higher, but you would expect that commensurately the income would as well. So you're essentially, the best way of explaining this is you're getting a smaller piece, but of a bigger pie. I can think of one client in particular. When they started with us, they were doing about 100,000 a month and their overhead was in the low 50s. Okay. So they're netting anywhere from $45,000 to $50,000 a month. Well, they expanded the practice, added associates, things got busier, and now they do about 400,000 a month, and their overhead is about 70%. So it used to be 50, now it's 70. So they're collecting 400 with a 70% overhead. They're netting about 120, right, or 30%. So they're netting a lot more than they used to net, but their overhead as a percentage is higher. So unless you can relate your overhead to your income, it's not super useful. The only time it becomes super useful, in a sense, I don't want to say it's the only time it becomes super useful, is if I've got a big practice with a lot of fixed expenses, rent and leases and loans and things like that, and then all of a sudden the place isn't producing anything. It's a lot more stressful than if it's a smaller practice that, doesn't have that high of a fixed overhead. That's usually why when we recommend a client acquire additional practices, we recommend that they don't go buy a really big office. Let's say your main office is doing, 180 to 300 or 400 a month, and you go, I want to get a satellite office, right? And there's older doctors selling their practice 1 or 2 towns over. It's a good acquisition target for you. Let's say it's doing, 30, 40, 50,000 a month, and it's got 4 chairs. That's not a bad buy because the fixed overhead associated with that is going to be nothing like your main practice, which is going to have this, massive fixed overhead. The fact that you're in your main practice constantly makes it work. Whereas with these satellite offices, I wouldn't expect you to be the person working there. You might go place implants once in a while, but you're mainly dedicated to your main office. Anyway, so you can always drop expenses and waste and things like this if you're trying to lower your overhead. And I will talk about this a little bit later, but it's very difficult to save your way, by saving and cutting expenses, to save your way into profitability. Okay. Sure, you can cut unneeded and unnecessary expense, but the usual handling when someone comes to me and their overhead is too high, of course, we're going to cut bad expenses, but the usual handling is to figure out why their income isn't higher versus expenses. That's going to be where I'm going to start. For example, let's say I'm meeting with a client and their overhead is $60,000 a month and they're collecting 80. So their overhead is 75%. But I look at the practice and the practice really has the potential to do at least 100. And, I'll of course look at that $60,000 overhead and see if there are some areas that we can cut. And we might cut a few things, but most of my effort is going to be figuring out why they're not doing 100 and getting them doing 100 as quickly as possible, while we're also cutting unnecessary expense. Because if I can get them doing 100 without any real increase in overhead by just, being a little bit more efficient, well then if they stick at that 60,000 overhead and now they're doing 100, their overhead's now 60% instead of 75%. And their net profit all goes up. So with all of that in mind, with this, thinking with the overhead the way I'm describing it, let's take a look at the top 6 reasons that we found why your overhead might be too high. And look, this is not all the reasons your overhead could be too high. That would be a very long episode. But we're going over the main reasons that we see. And it doesn't mean that there's one reason why your overhead's too high. It could be a combo of all of these things that I'm describing. As I go down, I'll start with what we found to be the biggest reason people's overhead is too high, which is poor case acceptance, bad case acceptance. So look, I've given this example before. Let's say you have this patient, Joe, and Joe needs 6 crowns. Joe needs 6 crowns and buildups or 6 crowns, right? But insurance is only going to participate in 2 crowns this year. So you explain to Joe why they need 6 crowns. That treatment plan at $1,300 a crown is $7,800. After explaining it to Joe, Joe asks, well, doc, what is my insurance going to do for these crowns? You go, well, the insurance is going to probably kick in for 2 of them. So Joe goes, well, can I do what insurance covers this year and then maybe do the other two next year and the year after? And you go, sure. Or Joe just go, maybe they don't even want to do the other ones next year. They just want to do the two that insurance covers this year. Well, let's look at this from a couple perspectives. Number one, if you multiply this problem by a number of instances in your practice, that $7,800 treatment plan, 6 crowns, becomes 2 crowns or no crowns, but let's say 2 crowns at $1,300 a crown, which is $2,600. You just lost potentially $5,200 in potential production and collections. And so if that's occurring in your practice a lot, you multiply this by, I don't know, even 5, 10 instances of this. This is $25,000 to $50,000 or more than $50,000 a month that you could have produced that you did not. All right. That will absolutely affect your bottom line as well as overall revenues. And then let's look at how long it took you to explain to Joe that Joe needed 6 crowns. Let's maybe took you 15, 20 minutes, right? Well, how much longer would it have taken to close Joe on doing all 6 rather than just doing the 2? Probably not a lot longer. Maybe another 5 minutes. You're already sitting down with Joe. You've already got the x-rays up. You've already got you've got the intraoral camera out. You've got, you're showing Joe what he needs. So it really wouldn't take that much longer. So that 20 minutes you spent selling Joe the 2 crowns could have been spent closing Joe for all 6. So that's costing you a lot as far as overall revenues. So what you have to be able to do is be able to reach Joe, like really get Joe to understand the treatment plan and get Joe to want his treatment plan. This is why, I try to stay away from shameless promotions. I'll have 1 or 2 as I do this episode. But this is why, one of the first services that an MGE client does is the MGE communication and sales seminars for the professional, where we teach you how to get your patients to want what they need. And to give you an idea, it's actually funny that I have to promote or sell these things. Because it's such a no-brainer. The average increase, it's 3-day seminars, okay? The average increase of someone who does these seminars is $288,000 a year. And that's not just a temporary increase. That could be continued, infinitely, okay? I mean, not infinitely, as long as you practice. So you spend whatever you spend. It's not very expensive, like $10,000 and change or whatever. And you make an extra $288 a year. It's a bit of a no-brainer. And there's plenty of people you could talk to. You probably know people who've been to these seminars. But the idea is by just capitalizing on those opportunities and spending you're not adding time. You're not doing anything different. And this is the funny thing. When I do our finance seminar, I'll just point this out to clients, right? And again, this is not to shamelessly promote, but I'll ask them, okay, so what was the increase you saw after doing your first sales and communication seminar? What do I hear? 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 after doing the first one. Well, they realize 2 things at the same time. And then I'll ask them follow-up questions. Did you have to hire a lot of staff to do that extra production? Because what happened the next month? No. And obviously this was a combination of how they were talking to new patients as well as patients of record. Okay, did you have to do a bunch of marketing to make that extra money? No, they'd started marketing that we taught them how to do, but it really hadn't had an opportunity to kick in yet. There's always a lag when you do marketing. If I start sending out postcards now, I may not see the benefit for, 1, 2, 3 weeks, right? So it wasn't a matter of adding expenses, adding a bunch of staff, or adding a bunch of marketing. All that changed was how they communicated with their patients. So what was the net impact on their overhead? It was 0. So that example I gave you of the doc who's doing 80 with an overhead of 60 and wants to do 100 or could do 100, if you teach this doctor to sell, all of a sudden they're doing 100 and that overhead is still 60. So what is that extra money? They were already servicing their bills at 80. That extra 20,000 is theirs. That's profit. Okay. So I'll put a link to these things on the episode webpage because you should check this out. The other thing that's cool about it is it's a win-win for everybody. You win because you're getting to do more of the dentistry you enjoy doing. Your practice wins because there's more revenue, but more importantly, the patient wins. Instead of doing 2 crowns, they're doing 6. You're actually restoring their oral health. Okay. They actually get something out of it as well. So I would definitely check that out. I'll put the link to it on the episode webpage, and let me know what you think. You can also email me if you have questions. So that's reason number 1, poor case acceptance. What's reason number 2? It's fees. Now, I've talked about this before in different episodes, and fees have taken on a whole new importance over the last 4 or 5 years. I did videos and I talk to clients whenever I do our finance seminar. We do it 2-3 times a year. Hey, don't forget to raise your fees, that sort of a thing. Back in 2015, 16, 11, 12. But back then inflation was 1.8, maybe 2% a year. It was really not that big of a deal. So someone might forget to raise their fees this year and then to raise them next year. It wasn't something that required urgent attention. When you have a 4-year period where you have an excess of a 21% increase, the importance of raising your fees takes on a whole new meaning. Because if you don't raise your fees, you're essentially pricing yourself out of the market, okay? Especially in the environment we're currently in. And the problem with this is normally the way docs raise their fees is they'll buy their practice or start their practice. They'll set their fees based on whatever guidance they have. There's different things out there you can look for, guidance-wise as far as, and I'll recommend one in particular that I really like. To set your fees. But then, so you set your fees in 2011 when you started your practice, but then you're not really seeking further guidance to make sure your fees are going up the way that they should be. You're just raising them what you think they should be raised. And I've seen a lot of people do this. And we'll analyze, when we get a new client here at MGE, we'll analyze their fee schedule. And if you're familiar with these different fee schedule products that are out there, the one that I recommend is called the Wasserman Guide. It's got a different name. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. But basically what it does is it analyzes fees, dental CDT codes by zip code in the United States, and it gives you a percentage range or a percentile range. Very simply what that means is if it goes anywhere from 40 to 90%. So if you're in the 40th percentile with a fee, let's say it's 2740 and your fee for 2740 is in the 40th percentile. What that means is that 40% of the doctors in your area charge the same or less than you do. 60% charge more. If you're in the 50th percentile, that means half charge less, half charge more. If you're in the 60th percentile, 40% charge more, 60% charge the same or less. Okay? To explain it. So we'll analyze the client's fees when they come here to MGE. And in most cases, most of their fees for services that are performed very often, crowns, root canals, preventive diagnostic treatment, basic services, etc., scalings, their fees are in below the 40th percentile. They're not even on the map. And they have been raising their fees over the years. They just lost the thread because they didn't have guidance to keep their fees relevant in their zip code as to what was going on. Now, what I will tell you is insurance companies definitely have this fee schedule. And if you keep charging low fees in your practice, it has a different, an interesting feedback loop that occurs. If let's say the UCR for a crown in your area is $1,200 and you're charging $1,000. And let's say you started charging $600 however many years ago, and now you're charging $1,000 and you think you've really raised your fees, but you're priced way lower than anybody else. You're actually lowering the expected UCR for your area for yourself and every other dentist, because that's how insurance companies come up with this. They compile the fees from that zip code from everybody filing insurance. Okay. Again, that's what I've been told. I don't know. I don't work for an insurance company, but get the idea. So you have to make sure that your fees track. They have to, you could be, if you're charging $200, $300, $400 less than you should be for various procedures, and you're doing that procedure multiple times per month, that adds up quickly. It becomes, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 real fast. So again, what I'd recommend, I put the link to it on the episode webpage, although you can use whatever your product you want. I like this product in particular. It's the Wasserman Guide. You buy it for 2024. I would recommend that you buy the developer version. It's a little more expensive. You get a little flash drive. And the reason I like it is it's exportable. You can check any zip code in the United States and whatever. I don't know how the export would work to your software, whether it's Open Dental, Dentrix, or EagleSoft, but it's exportable, so you can at least export it to a spreadsheet. And you should compare it to your fees. You might find that your fees are way low, and that might be losing you $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a month. And the funny thing is, most patients might not even notice if those fees were to go up, because if they're insured, in a lot of cases, insurance would pay. Which brings us to the next point with regards to, this is again why your overhead is too high, is PPOs. This relates to fees. If you're in any managed care networks, you're in network. Again, this is something I've beaten the drum about pretty hard. Just for your own edification, maybe edification is the wrong word, for your own illumination and information, here's what I recommend that you do, because you probably haven't done this in a while. I want you to find out what you should be charging for a procedure in your practice. Maybe you get the Wasserman guide and maybe you want to be in the 60th percentile and look at what you should be charging for various codes that you perform very often. And I want you to look at what you're actually charging in network. I want you to just look at that. Usually the percentage write-off, and I'm sure some people will disagree with me on this, what I have seen by examining a number of plans is on preventive and diagnostic treatment, you're writing off at least 50%, sometimes more. On basic and major, it could be as low as 30%, the write-off, or it could be as high as 50 plus, depending on the plan. So that $1,300 at full fee crown that you're charging for, you're only getting $780 from the insurance company. So, and I mentioned this, I think, a while back. Sometimes you forget because you do seminars and you do podcasts, you forget where you talked about this. But if you were to talk to anybody who's been in the profession since, let's say, the 90s or 80s, they've been practicing for a while, and you ask them when they first started practicing dentistry, what was the recommended overhead percentage you should be at? And the answer you're going to get is 50%. In other words, if I was practicing in 1992 and I was listening to all the dental gurus, as far as what my overhead should be, I would have been told it should be 50% or less. That should be my overhead. If I'm producing 100, I should be have an overhead of 50. Well, why was it 50%? Well, it was 50% because that's what it should be. But now you very rarely run into people with a 50% overhead anymore. Well, why? Well, think with this for a second. If my practice at full fee would do $150,000, that means my overhead should be 75. But I'm not running at full fee because I'm in PPOs, right? So I'm eating 30 to 50% on various procedures, depending on the PPO. So instead of producing and collecting 150, I'm actually producing 100. Okay. I'm writing off 33%. That's being kind here. But my overhead doesn't change. My overhead is still 75% because I see zero benefit in my overhead from being in a PPO. My assistant isn't charging me less for prepping a PPO crown or helping me prep a PPO crown. My lab doesn't charge me less because it's a PPO patient. My landlord doesn't give me a break because I was working on a PPO patient today. Like your electric company. I go on. It's stupid, right? No one's giving you a break. So the only person who's eating it as a result of all of this is you. So that office that at full fee was doing 150 should have an overhead of 75-ish. But instead it's doing 100 because it's writing off all this stuff due to PPOs. So it doesn't work. That's probably, if I were to pick, that and case acceptance would be the main reasons why overheads, when you look at the average dentist practice in the United States, why their overhead's so high. Then compounding this, especially since 2020, is inflation. And the insurance company's response to this has not been to increase reimbursements. In some cases, it's been to lower reimbursement. So in the face of 21% official inflation, you have lowered reimbursements and you can't just raise the fee. If I'm in a normal business, like here at MGE, I can raise my fees because, I have to pay staff more. I have to pay more for my power bill. I have to pay more for this. I have to pay more for that. I can raise my fees. It's just what most companies do. They pass it on to the consumer, right? That's what restaurants do. Everybody does this. This is part of business 101. Well, if you're in network, you can't raise your fees. You have to go with their fee schedule. So it puts you in a really dangerous trap, especially in an inflationary environment. Why am I beating on this so hard? Why have I talked about it so much? Well, mainly because getting out of network may take time. We've had clients who just go, heck with it, I'm out. And we've had clients who want to phase it over time because they find that to be more comfortable. Look, to each his own. You got to do what's real to you. You want to do this in a way where you can sleep at night. But, whereas in the past we would tell people it's a good idea to get out, we recommend every client, you need to figure out, part of the figure out with you is we need to figure out how to get you out of network. You need to be out. Okay. Because you cannot stay in network long term and expect to have a profitable good scene long term. The only thing I'd recommend is you could get really enthusiastic about this and go, you know what? I'm just getting out of network and blah, 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 and dump everything. That could be dangerous if you don't have a plan. Okay. And there is a plan that should be figured out before you actually start down this path. And remember, some PPOs may take you a while to get out of, but I do recommend that everybody works their way out of these things. And, the idea that you're going to lose a bunch of patients, sure, you will lose some patients. The average patient loss is about 30%. So if you have 1,000 patients who are in a certain plan, you're going to lose 300 of those. All I would tell you about this is two things. Number one, actually, I'm going to just tell you one thing. If you do that and you start charging full fee, you're actually going to make the same or more amount of income while working less and having lower labor and material costs. If you have 3 patients who need a crown in network and you drop the network and 1 leaves, which is more than 30%, well, if you'd done 3 crowns at $800, that would have been $2,400. Instead, now you're doing 2 at $1,300. That's $2,600. You have a lower lab fee, material cost, assistant time, etc. It's a bit of a no-brainer, but it has to be done smart. Here's what I'd recommend. If you're ready to do this, because remember, this takes time. Okay. Any journey starts with the first step, right? Here's what I recommend. We have something called the fees and plans analysis, where we'll look all this over with you and give you some recommendations on how to phase yourself out of network. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. It is free. And look, we give this stuff away for free. Obviously, with the downloads that I offer, those are completely free. You may do the fees and plans analysis and want to take advantage of some of our services. That's up to you. We will still do it whether you do or don't. Okay. But I would definitely recommend that you check it out because, the more you procrastinate about this, the more time goes by, the more inflation occurs, and the further behind you find yourself. So I would definitely recommend you look at this. All right. So that's reason number 3. What's reason number 4? Well, this is a combo of either underproducing or being overstaffed. Now, the problem with some of these things is there's a bunch of different ways this could show up. So I'm going to give you a few examples so you get the flavor of what I'm looking at here. So this could appear in many ways. You might have an associate that you're not really utilizing, but you're having to pay them $750 or $1,000 per day. So there are hours in a given week. Again, we might see them once in a while sitting around, but you combine this in a week, it might be 5-6 hours that they're sitting there doing nothing. Or you feel bad that they're doing nothing. So you're giving them your procedures. So then you're not busy. Okay. You might have 3 hygienists and their schedules are 50% full because you don't have an adequate staff complement at the front to actually chase patients to get them back on the schedule. You may have too many people at the front for the number of providers that you have. I mean, there's a number of different things, right? And this is something where I would, if you find yourself in this situation, how it will normally manifest is your payroll percentage is too high as a percentage of income. Normally payroll excluding the owner doctor and associates, but including everybody else should not exceed 22.5%, including payroll taxes in the United States. So again, just to reiterate, if I have a dental practice and I'm collecting $100,000, my payroll should not be higher than 22.5%, which is $22,500, excluding associates and me, but does include the office manager, the hygienist, etc. If I have this underproducing, overstaffed issue, it might be at 30%, 31%, something of that nature, right? The only other thing I'd add to this is you might also have a situation where you've got some really good staff who are working very hard, but you have one staff member who's a real problem, creating a lot of drama, upset, excessive added work, where you're having to referee between 2 or 3 employees because of this one person, or the person does such a poor job that the other staff had to do their jobs and do the other person's job as well from time to time because they're not doing a good job. You need to handle that. That's going to lower morale. It's also going to make your office, bit too much drama. So you're going to want to get that out of the practice. Otherwise, you're going to lose good staff. Then we have reason number 5, which is bad return on investment. Bad return on investment. In other words, you've started paying an expense on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis or whatever, and the ROI on it is just not very good. For example, you have a marketing campaign and the return on it is just very bad. Now, obviously with a marketing campaign, I've done whole episodes on this. A marketing campaign's job is to create responses. Okay. Create responses, people reaching into your practice, whether with an implant funnel, that might be a form lead. With Google ads or Facebook or whatever, it might be a phone call, something along these lines. That's the whole purpose of a marketing campaign. So I could have a great marketing campaign creating a ton of responses, but we're not converting any of the leads. Okay. So that's not necessarily the marketing's fault. If it's creating no responses, that's the marketing's fault. In any event, marketing is not cheap. Google ads have gone up excessively over the last 4 or 5 years. Postage, we used to mail out, tons. I used to mail a magazine to the entire dental profession once a quarter in the United States as well as in Canada. And we've had to, figure out different strategies on some of this because postage has gone from prior to the pandemic, it was in the 40 cent range, 40 something. Now it's in the 70 something cent range. It's excessive. So you're spending a lot to get your marketing out. Okay. So you have to make sure that you're taking advantage of the leads that are coming in. If you don't, you're going to see bad ROI, or if the marketing's just not getting you a response. Same thing. You could have a staff member and they're not really doing their job. So you're paying them, whatever, 50, 60,000 a year, and they're just really not doing their job. They're in charge of your schedule and your schedule's empty all the time. It's bad ROI. You could also be overpaying. You have a dental assistant. The average salary in that area is $30 and you're paying this assistant $45. You're overpaying for what they deliver. Okay. You're overpaying for the ROI is not good. And of course, we've all seen this with equipment where people buy equipment that, is cool and they really like it, but they don't really take advantage of it. We saw this with Cyrix years ago. Again, I have no hate for the Cyrix. I think it's a great machine and I have a problem with it, but I saw people buying Cyrix they just didn't use. So all they ended up with was a lease payment. Or cone beams, again, good thing to have, great piece of equipment, but if you're doing one a month, okay, was it really worth going out and buying one rather than farming those out, right? All right. And that brings us to the sixth reason of the top six, not necessarily in any particular order, that your overhead may be too high, which is a combo of no budgets, or expense control or waste. So you don't have hard budgets. There's no control over expenses and you have waste. I mentioned I was going to talk about waste. I didn't realize it was the last point. I mean, I guess I did. I didn't realize it as I was saying it. But, how would that look? Well, you might be ordering more dental supplies than you need. You could also be wasting them. The bone graft material, instead of using the amount you're supposed to, you're using, your associates using twice as much as they need, right? Or your dental assistant is over ordering certain supplies that expire, right? Because you ordered too many, so you have more than you need, so it just expires. There's different ways of looking at this. Again, you're going to recover some expense with this, but not near the amount of, you're not going to see the profitability turnaround that you'll see with, let's say, improving case acceptance by going down this line. That's why I wouldn't make the mistakes of let me hunt through and find out how I can spend less on supplies because I'm not profitable. Yes, I would do that, but that wouldn't be where I'd start. Okay. Look, I've cut expenses for a practice by 10, 20,000 a month, but some of those cuts were some pretty hard decisions, but it was required at that time while also figuring out if I'm going to cut expenses, I have to figure out how to keep income and revenue maximized. So, there's some hard decisions to make. You might have certain things where expense categories where this happens with dental supplies. It happens with office supplies, for example. You have an expense account, a credit card with Staples or Office Depot or whatever, or with Patterson, Shine, DC Dental, whoever you use. It's an open expense account, but there's no hard budget set on this. Your dental assistant doesn't know that we can only spend $5,000 this month on dental supplies. That's your budget. Or your manager doesn't know that our office supply budget is $500. So they just order things because they need them. I'm doing quotation fingers as I say that, but they're not looking at how much they're ordering versus how much they're supposed to spend. So that will allow expense categories to get out of control. The only thing I'd warn you about is, especially with dental supplies, you're going to run out of those for the most part due to use, right? So if, let's say, we're averaging 120 a month, that's our average collections and production, and that's our average. So I've got a set office supply or a dental supply budget of $5,000, let's say. Well, one month, it's mid-month, and we're already at 90,000. We're on track for 180,000, almost 200,000 this month. I'm going to need more supplies than usual, so I'm going to have to release a little bit more funds to my office manager or give them permission to order a little bit more supplies, or the lead dental assistant permission to order more supplies than we would normally order just based on use. So it's just something to keep in mind. Anyway, so those are the top 6 reasons, when we look at an overhead sheet. I've looked at, hundreds, if not thousands of these things, that we're going to attack or fix in order to get the overhead under control and to maximize profitability, right? So if your overhead is too high and your profit's low, chances are it's one or a combo of what these 6 things I've talked about. And as I mentioned when I started, this is by no means all the reasons. There are other reasons that could happen as well. But, it's not common. There'd be more or less common reasons why this might happen. In any event, if you find yourself in this boat, I hope this helps and it gets you started on the path to more profit. So I have all those downloads that I mentioned in the episode. I'll put a link to that ADA statistic for income, the MGE communication and sales seminars, the fees and plans analysis, as well as the overhead sheet. You can check those out and get more information. If you'd like to know more about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Folks, have a great week, and we will see you at the next episode.